Guten Tag, wie geht's? So I want to share 4 books that I read in the last 2 weeks. These books. Okay, so book number 1 is Crescent and Star. Now this is a book about Turkey, and it's written by a German journalist who calls himself a Turkophile. Basically, he lived in Turkey a lot. He actually swam across the Bosphorus. The book is really, really good. It covers a lot of the modern issues inside the country. It's a bit dated because it was last revised in 2008, and obviously a lot has happened since then. But there are a lot of core issues and problems in the country that he really touches on that haven't been resolved yet. And I like the way that he frames the country. He says that a lot of the problems that are faced in the country are particularly emblematic of new republics, of countries that are just beginning to enter new stages of political development. So he has a very positive outlook on the country, which I like. I tend to have a positive outlook on the country as well. There are some biases that you'll have to catch, and I suggest reading Andrew Mango's book, Turks Today. That's another good book on Turkey, and it'll help you catch some of his biases. But yeah, that was one book I read, and I actually recommend people read this book. The Art of the Wasted Day. Now this is a prose book, so basically it's not filled with factual information, it's kind of written very aesthetically. But the cool thing in this book was it talks about like Michel de Montaigne and people who learned how to waste their time and didn't view wasting their time as like necessarily a bad thing. Michel de Montaigne basically recluded from modern life to write essays. He was kind of just sitting in his chateau writing essays, moping around, not doing anything particularly important. And she talks about that in this book. She also talks about how people kind of forget the nature of leisure, especially like in the West, where you have to climb the corporate ladder, you have to work 80 hours a week, yada 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 yada. People forget the nature of leisure and how there's like an art form to wasting your time. This is a fun book. I wouldn't recommend everybody read it. There's other books that you can read that are better, but it was a fun book. The Longevity Diet. So this book and the Blue Zones diet book are my 2 favorite diet books of all time. This book, I mean, it's similar to the Blue Zone book, but it has a lot more research on things like fasts and calorie restrictions. For example, in the longevity community, there's this debate about, you should do CR, right? Calorie restriction. Because there were studies with like animals where they found that when you reduce their caloric intake by 30 to 20%, they live longer, and not only do they live longer while being disease-free. So their health span is also better. But he gave counter research to this where actually when you put animals who do CR up against animals that are doing a Blue Zone diet or a Mediterranean diet, there's no significant differences. Right? So the CR benefit isn't so much the caloric restriction. It might be that in the case of the CR studies where they were up against animals that were eating regular diets aren't particularly healthy. And in fact, in some of those CR studies, the animals were allowed to eat freely, basically as much as they want, which obviously led to overeating. The last book that I read was Syria. This country is very, very complex. To put it briefly, there are 9 to 10 countries that I can think of offhand that have invested into militias in Syria, okay? So this is a very complex issue. And this book goes over it kind of well. It goes over very briefly Syria in the Ottoman era, and the French time where the Syria was a French colony. It goes over that. Then it steps a little bit more into the modern times, where how the conflicts in Syria began to unfold between the regime and the protesters. And then towards the middle, to the end of the book, it goes into all the militias that are being funded by, again, these 10 or 9 countries that all have different goals, right? Like the militias by no means agree with one another, which has then led to like the continuation of the conflict. He also talks about how the rebuilding program in Syria is not going as planned because there's still ongoing violence by Russia, which has led to the fact that people don't want to invest money into the region because they think it's going to get bombed again or whatever. So the reconstruction plan's not going as well as thought. It's a very complex issue, and I'm sure this book has biases. I don't know much about this country or this topic, but it was a really good book, and for an introduction, I would strongly recommend it to people. So these are the 4 books that I read in the last 2 weeks. I recommend at least 3 of them, 1, 2, and 3. But with that being said, tschüss.